situated in exactly the right place, and the glare is now gone away. Wonderful. Okay, Kvei. So as you probably heard, we got as far as 2/3 of the Bir Halacha. I was aware that there are two shitas. I turn it over to you.
Okay, before I start, two HAKDAMAHs. The Gemara Masechtas Megillah tells us that Haman told Achashverosh there's no point in keeping the Jews because as Dosei HaMelech Einam Oisim, HaMelech Ein Shav La'anicham, because they say Shabbos Hayoyim, Pesach Hayoyim. So I was very Makil Kolam many years ago, and somebody asked the question, Pesach Hayoyim, it's 7 days a year. Shabbos, I understand, is once a week. But the person said, the Asik of Matzos, if you follow the cycle to make matzahs, you got to start. It starts sometime a little after spring. In May, in Sivan, they're going to be cutting the wheat for next year's matzahs. It's a full year job. Esrogim is also a full year job. Mitzvahs don't just happen overnight in 1 minute. Everything takes time, and that's what Haman was telling Achashverosh. Pesach Hayoyim. It's not a 1 minute. You go to the store, you pick up matzahs, and it's already. The whole year, Jews are telling their boss that it's Pesach Hayoyim, and they wouldn't be able to work. Now, before we get on to the actual going to the matzah bakery, I'd like to give a little small hakdamah on the inyan of why a person, besides the chumras that would be involved in chabura matzah, why there would be an inyan for a person to make his own matzahs. Is there an inyan, one could say, Torah says, Be'erev teichel matzahs, come home, matzahs are on the table. How they got there doesn't make a difference to me. As long as I know it has a good hechsher, I want to make the mitzvah matzahs. That's it. That's all I'd like to do. Why would I have to go ahead and bake matzahs? Is there any mitzvah involved? Same way by sukkah. There's no mitzvah to go ahead and build a sukkah. All you need to have is a ready-made sukkah. You go into your friend's sukkah. You did the mitzvah the same way. How do we look at the mitzvah of making matzahs? So the Torah in Siman Tov Samach quotes the lashon of the Rosh. That the Rosh was mishtadel ba'atzmoi. He worked and did the lisha and he did the aricha and he himself actually worked on doing the matzahs. And he did it by himself. And then afterwards he let other people help him. But the Rosh himself put Asik into Bimakayim to make the matzahs himself. This is the words of the Rosh in Siman Tov Samach. The question is why? You could say that the Rosh wasn't so, he was worried about the kashrus of the matzah. So he had to make sure he himself was involved in what's happening to the matzah. So he himself wanted to be involved to make sure the matzah was done properly. But if you look in the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Tov Samach, the Shulchan Aruch uses the words persons should be mishtadel to make matzah. Tov Samach ois beis. Shulchan Aruch says, I think we have it. HaRosh mishtadel b'mitzvahs matzah. V'oimed al asiyoso u'mezares ha'oiskem behem u'mesayeh barichos. V'chein roi l'chol odom lasois l'hatpel hu b'mitzvah atzma. So we have the words. The Torah says nibalei ma'isa v'chasidim machmirim al atzmim k'go'inam machmirim ba'atzmim v'oifim. Kahidam rinon ma darka shaloni hu masik v'ishtei oifim. L'chein mitzvah al kol odom l'shtada b'asiyas ha'matz u'ba'afiyos. So the Torah says it's not something special. You think maybe the Rosh did it because he was worried about the kashrus. No, it's a mitzvah on every person. These are the words of the Torah. Now, if you turn to the Mishnah Brura on this halacha, Mishnah Brura offers a different reason. Very hard. He quotes the Rosh The Mishnah Brura says a different reason. Right before it's underlined, the mitzvah boy yoisemi b'shlucha. The Rosh says the reason why the Rosh worked on the matzahs, that Mishnah Brura Sifkat and Hey, the small Mishnah Brura, the mitzvah boy yoisemi b'shlucha. That the mitzvah is greater to be done by yourself, greater than a shliach. If you look back at the previous page, the Rosh offered a different reason. The Rosh said that ma darka shalani is hu masik v'ishtay yoif. Does not sound like a reason of mitzvah bo yoisemi b'shlucha. It sounds like it's more of a din in lechem oini. The Gemara says ma darka shalani that he works ishtay yoifa. Poor person doesn't have slaves, people doing the work for him. Everything has to be done by himself. So he's masik and ishtay is oif. So too, the Cheno Mishtade Basiyas HaMatzos. So it sounds like a machlokes between the Rosh and the Mishabru is quoting a Magen Avram, two reasons why a person should be oisik in the Asiyas HaMatzos. We have the reason of the Rosh of Lechem Oini. We have the reason of the Magen Avram of Mitzvah Bo Yotzim B'Shluch. So I just wanted to say that maybe there is a nafkamina. It could be the reason why the Rosh did not want to give the reason of the Magen Avram, because who said that baking matzahs in itself is a mitzvah? Maybe the mitzvah is just to have matzahs. So who said on a hechsher mitzvah to prepare, once preparing himself to do a mitzvah, in preparation on that is halacha mitzvah bo yotzim v'shluchai. If you're doing a mitzvah in itself, the Gemara by Kedushin says two cases that the Gemara says mitzvah bo yotzim v'shluchai. One case is that a person should mekayesh isha by himself instead of sending a shliach, and the second case is preparing for Shabbos. On that, maybe those two are not only a hechsher mitzvah, they themselves are a mitzvah. Kedushin for sure is a mitzvah to get married. Which one could disagree? Maybe it's only a hechsher mitzvah proof. And preparing for Shabbos, the Biskrov was married that the mitzvah itself is the preparation. The kavod Shabbos is that you should prepare. But who said on a hechsher mitzvah by itself just to prepare, make matzahs? On that is the inyan of mitzvah bo yosim shluchoi. So for that, the Rosh came up with a new reason. But there's another nafkamina the other way. If it's ma darker shel oni, the only time you need lechem oni is lechem for the seder. The rest of Pesach, a person could eat even matzah ashira. We happen to not eat matzah ashira because we're concerned that we don't know what makes things into chametz. But in the olden days, on Medina de Gemara, only for the seder you need to have lechem oni. After the seder, you want to have your egg matzah. You want to dip your matzah into, but the seder you have to eat plain matzah. You can't dip it into charoisis to be yotze your matzah's mitzvah. The rest of Pesach, you want to put something on top of your matzah. Enjoy it. There's no problem as long as you eat your brachs. But you won't have the problem of lechem oini. Masha'enkin, according to the reason of Magen Avram, that there's the inyan of mitzvah bo yosim b'shluchoi, will come out that there will be a nafkamina that even for the rest of Pesach, since we know the Vilna Goyen was machadish, that besides for the mitzvah of eating matzah leil seder is a mitzvah to eat matzah the whole Pesach, so then you'd have an inyan that not only for matzah's mitzvah you should bake, one should bake matzah for the rest of Pesach. Now, another nafkamina would be in this nafkamina between mitzvah bo yosim and shluchoi is there's a very interesting bir halacha regarding preparation for Shabbos. We know that the halacha is if somebody is learning and comes to a mitzvah that could be done by somebody else. So the halacha is by Talmud Torah, if it's a mitzvah she'ef shel asay sa'idei acherim, a person does not stop learning to do the mitzvah. If you're learning and another mitzvah comes up, you have an opportunity. The halacha is you continue doing the mitzvah. You continue learning. If the mitzvah can't be done by somebody else and you're the only one that could do it, you say I have to close the Gemara. Even though in general there's a halacha of oisik b'mitzvah patan mitzvah, by Talmud Torah there's no such halacha. You have to close the Gemara to go ahead and do a mitzvah and nobody else could do. Says the Sharatzin, what about the halacha of mitzvah bo yosim v'shluch? So the mitzvah is going to get done anyways. You're going to have the kedushin, you're going to have the sukkah built, you're going to have the matzah. The question is the extra hiddur of mitzvah bo yosim v'shluchai. How do we look at such a mitzvah? Do we say that since the person is learning, so the mitzvah bo yosim v'shluchai is only like a hiddur mitzvah, making the mitzvah a little nicer, so you continue learning? Or we say no. Since the mitzvah is mutal on you, you're mechuyev to do it because it's your mitzvah, and then on that is a mila to your mitzvah, and we say mitzvah bo yosim v'shluchai, you close the Gemara. This is a suffix in the bir halacha in Siman Reish Nun. Comes up in other places in halacha. Others want to be mefakpik. Why would you leave yeshiva to go light ner Chanukah? Have your wife be a shliach. You say no, mitzvah bo yosim v'shluchai. It's better that you should do the mitzvah yourself. Close the Gemara. This is two terutzim in the Sharatzin. One teretz is that since the mitzvah is obligated on you, and then it's a hiddur to your mitzvah, you have to close the Gemara. The other teretz is that only for kavod Shabbos we find that Rava was malach shavuta, Safra was malach reisha, but kavod Shabbos is greater. That the actual preparation is showing kavod for Shabbos. There we say you close the Gemara to prepare for Shabbos. So for Shabbos, everybody agrees person would have to close his Gemara to prepare for to prepare for the Shabbos. How about baking the matzahs? If the reason will be mitzvah b'yosim v'shluchai, one could say that you don't have to. It's be telling the two truths in the Bir Halacha. A person has to stop learning to prepare to go make matzah. Masha'in kein lefi the second Teretz HaSha'atzin is a special halacha in Hilchos Shabbos, then you do not stop learning. But if you go with the reason that the Rosh offers, that it's a madaka shaloni, it's a kim and lechem oini, that you can't get done by anybody else. So the only way to have the matzah done properly is that you yourself should go bake, because it's a kim and lechem oini, a madaka shaloni, it's humasik v'shtayofet. That's not going to help you, anyone doing it, and you have to close the Gemara to go ahead and do it. Now, it's interesting to note that those that are familiar with the customs of Beis Brisk and other people that are daftik and mitzvahs, in Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, they're very busy. They would have no problem taking off time to go from Seder to go find the kosher lulav and esrog. But the minig in Yeshiva, for the Mishpachas Brisk, Sire of David Zatzar, Rabbi Meshua, Rameir, all the families of Brisk, the time the Briskerov baked matzahs was the first Sunday of Rosh Chodesh Nisan. He didn't do it during the Zman. He waited till after the Zman, and that's the first Sunday that there's no yeshiva. He was always makbet to bake on a Sunday, because like this, the oven wasn't used for 24 hours, so he wouldn't have any shalas to the ben yoimai, a chumrah of the Briskerov, so he always baked on Sunday, and it was the first Sunday of Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So I'm not sure if it's a ride that he wouldn't take off from learning, or it's just practical. If you could get, if you are the Briskerov and the bakery will give you any time slot you want, so then, of course, the best time to do it would be the Sunday that nobody has yeshiva. It's ben azman, and you have opportunity to bake matzahs. I would assume that if he wouldn't have had that opportunity, and the only other time to bake it would be during the Zman, he would do it. But for mitzvah matzahs, he pushed off to bake it till Rosh Chodesh Nisan. That is the meaning of the Mishpachas Soloveitchik. Now, I just wanted to finish. The Mishnah Berurah ends up with a few very nice words about what happens if somebody themselves goes to bake matzahs. And I think it's the only time you'll find this in the Mishnah Berurah. If we could turn back to the Mishnah Berurah, is Vav and Zayin. So he says the mitzvahs matzah, my real pasuk lizorkein lechatchila b'chol hamatzahs. Not only the matzahs they're using for the seder, even matzahs that you're eating the whole yontif. I assume either he held there's no mitzvah, so he's saying there's a chiddush, or he held it's only midin lechem oinis. He's telling you a chiddush that even that you should still be careful. V'chein kosev brichodesh the gam b'afiyah shara matzahs anas zechol yimos haPesach or yinoig lamer agabeim ki rabba mechshol. You have to be careful with the hechsher. So forget about the issue involved of mitzvah b'yosim and shluchai. You have to be careful. Then he says, "Chein kosev b'chok Yaakov." Now, do we have the Mishnah Berurah Ches? There's one more Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Oiz Zayin. Sorry, Zayin. Yitroyach ba'atzmoi b'matzas mitzvah ad sheyischamim v'yazeya. Person should work on himself a matzas mitzvah until he's nischamim, he sweats, he gets hot, and then he sweats. So even though we know in other Sfarim it said there's certain averos that very hard to do tshuva for, the Mishnah Berurah says the sweat that a person does for making matzahs ki machaper on terrible sins. This is Mishnah Berurah. It's not a Kabbalistic sefer. He quotes it from the Ari. I don't know anywhere else in Mishnah Berurah he quotes such a thing, that there's a mitzvah that a person does that through the sweat he can machaper averos. It is interesting to note that there are, on the side of the Shulchan Aruch, in Hilchos Shabbos, we find a similar lashon, that the sweat that a person Sha'atshuva brings, that the sweat that a person has in the Achana for Shabbos, mitzvah b'yosim v'shulchay, could also be machaper on averos. But from these few reasons of mitzvah b'yosim v'shulchay, and you have the mile of lechem oini, and then adding on top of that it can machaper a person's averos, be a tremendous mile for a person to mishtadel ba'atzmoi to go bake matzahs mitzvah, and maybe even kedai to take off from learning if the only time that he could get is during most people by now either many people by now have already baked their matzahs. For Chodesh Nisan, they're dying down the production. It would be kedai for a person to go to bake matzahs. That's the Hakdamah on the mitzvah of baking matzahs. And it's interesting to note that the Yehuda wants to know why if it's such a big mitzvah, we're saying mitzvah b'yosim v'shluchai, why don't you make a bracha on making matzahs? You don't find any bracha on the making of matzahs. So the Yehuda says because you're not sure if it's going to come out perfect. You make a bracha before you start, and then you have to throw it out. Abile bracha v'atala. He compares it to Tosfos, says why there's no bracha on Shir Zayin Nikiyim, because something might happen and it won't make it to 7 days. So too, he says there's no bracha on baking matzahs because we're not sure it's going to come out perfect. This is the Hakdamah to the mitzvah of the actual mitzvah baking matzahs. Now, I'd like to get back to the main topic of the shir, would be the other mile that's involved in what we call Rosh Matzahs. Till now we have Hakdamah that the Rosh himself was machbet to bake matzahs. Doesn't say because he was worried about the kashrus of the matzah. The main reason why the Rosh himself baked matzahs is because of the Gemara of Darka Shalani. Kim and Lechem Oini. Another kim in the matzah is hu masik ve'ishtei oif. And then we have the Mishnah Berurah's reason of mitzvah b'yosim v'shluchai, and the nafkaminas, it depends on the case. That's the step one. Then what? Besides for that, there's another chumrah that people have. Just to add on one nakuda that I saw from Rav Gershon Zaks, that he said that maybe according to this idea of the lechem oini, you'd have to own the wheat before when you're working on it, because if it's like the Gemara says, hu masik, he's grinding and his wife's baking, it has to be his matzah. If it's somebody else's matzah, you might not have this kim mitzvah b'yosim v'shlucha. You wouldn't have to own the matzah. That'd be another nafkamina. Now I'd like to get to the main topic at hand. Is besides for the mile of baking matzahs and the kaparas avonis that a person gets from baking matzahs, there's another reason why it became popular in the last 30, 40 years, the inyan of a chabura matzah. What's a chabura trying to achieve besides for the mile of the Rosh, Mishtada Ba'atz? And the chumrah, the Mishnah Berurah, and how the Chazanish took this chumrah and the different shittas involved. So simple, everyone, we grow up, we know that matzahs have to be made within 18 minutes, which even that is debatable if a shear of a mill is 18 minutes or it's 22 and a half. But for matzah, everybody's machmer, to make a matzah within 18 minutes. Like we know the shear of a mill, matzah Shabbos, says is 4 mil, 4 times 18, 72. The minig, they accept the minig that a mill is 18 minutes. So you have to have your matzah done within the shear of a mill. And that's every matzah bakery has. They put from the minute the water hits the flour, they start on the clock for 17 minutes. And as soon as they shouldn't get into any shilas, by 17 minutes, they shut down the production. Now the question is, so what's the big deal? Let's go to a matzah bakery, we time them, the mashgiach's watching, everything's on the clock, 17 minutes, they start till end, come out with fresh matzah. What could be desired more that somebody would make a chabura to be machmer, to mahadir, to get what we call rosh matzah, which is what you'd see in the store called as chabura matzah, is that they're being machmer to get the rosh. You could get it, even if a person doesn't have the opportunity to come and bake himself, you could buy matzah that is called chabura matzah. That from different places to get. You could hire somebody that he'll be your chabura for you if it's too much for you to make it down. You have the yeshiva you have the shiurim and it's hard to take off. You go bake matzah, you could buy chabura matzah. So this starts with the words of a Tshuvas HaRosh in Siman Yudal. Because what's a chabura trying to achieve? So if we could have the Tshuvas HaRosh in Siman Yudal.
Yeah, so can we put on the Tshuvas HaRosh, Rabbi Say? Excuse me a second, it's going to take a second to put on. Here we go. So the Rosh is discussing, first he starts off, it's not underlined, that's not important, the halachas of Mayim Shalanu, and then the Rosh says, she should be oisig in it.
Anytime a person's working on an ASIC, and this is very important to note, we'll see. This everybody agrees. This is even more than 18 minutes. Anytime a person's oisik in a botzik, he could be oisik the whole yom, and it's not going to come chametz. Aval achar shenis asik boy, once a person put work into it, there's the heat of the person's body. Right away it comes chametz. He doesn't say no eitzes, no 18 minutes. Doesn't say anything about a mill. He says that the minute a person, once you started working on the matzah, which we're going to have to define that soon, once you started working on the matzah, if you leave it for a minute without asik, miyad machmetz. Then he says another chumrah, which this chumrah everybody agrees on. If the mashgiach does not follow this, you really, it would be a shal of chametz. The korav l'taner ein lolish. Person cannot do lisha nechoim ha'ish. If it's close to the fire, you cannot do lisha because of the heat of the fire, and that will make the matzah come chametz fast. And that every matzah bakery is makbid on. That once it gets to the oven, there nobody will have any matzah waiting. They're going to put it on the stick outside a room outside of the oven, because if inside the oven room the matzah waits for a minute, then the Rosh already says if it's not in the fire, outside of an oven, you have a heat of 500 degrees. You don't have the heat of a fire. I don't know, whatever degree you have, that everybody agrees that choyim ha'esh will make it chametz even faster than 18 minutes. So the Rosh doesn't even discuss the shear of a mill. Doesn't tell us anything about when do we apply. The Gemara says, we know from Shulchan Aruch, everybody knows that matzah comes chametz after 18 minutes. This Shuvas Rosh leaves us hanging in the dark. What's the shear of the mill? When do we apply the shear of the mill? He says once you start working on it, which we'll have to define, because we know the Gemara says you have 18 minutes. The Rosh says once you start working on the Isa, then miyad umachmetz. So the question is, what is the shear, and when do we apply this halach of the Rosh? So we have the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef, when he discusses this halacha, he quotes the Rosh and this chumrah of close to the fire, and a second later in Siman Tov Nun Tes, then he brings a Tshuvas Sadeshin. He brings the words of the Tshuvas Sadeshin.
No, this is not the right one. So let's get the Marmakum. What would you like us to put up?
The Beis Yosef and Tov Nun Tes of the Darkei Moshe. We have it.
No, we have it. We have it in the package. We don't need this.
Oh.
We don't. Rav Pesach, please go back to the package. No, not this pack. I think we have in Rabbi Kahn's package, please.
I put it up, so it should be.
First one. There you go.
Yeah. So we have the Beis Yosef quotes the Rosh, and a second later, without making realizing that he's changing all the halachas,
there we are.
Quotes a little further down, because of Rosh, afterwards underlined, because of Rosh b'tshuva, kol zman she'oiskim b'batzek, ein machmetz. Anytime you're working on the batzek, it does not become chametz. Aval achar shenisasik nescham tachas yadayim, it's miyad machmetz. Says v'chein kosav Rabbeinu Yeruchim b'chele gimel, the same halach. B'tshumas adeshen kosav, simin kufchav gimel kosav. Hod the kaimel on that which we say im sho habatzik belimis askim kashir hilach mil. If it's left without asik up to 18 minutes, chashvin like chametz. V'im lo yisho kashir azeb pamachas el pamayim. What happens if you left the matzah without any work? But you didn't do it for 18 minutes straight. It's asik b'netayim kasher tzarfu ashiyis. He has a discussion a machloikis. If you could combine the matzah waiting two separate times. You started working, you stopped for a few minutes, you started again, then he stops for a few minutes. He brings
Can I ask the
shiloh
Rav a
back
question?
and forth.
Can I ask her a question? In order to clarify this, remember we discussed going through the steps
Yes.
of MATZOS, because I think it would be helpful to do it now, because you are going to use terminology that I was not familiar with. So can we spend this 5 minutes and we'll come back to this machlekes here, right where we stopped?
Yes.
Okay. We're making a shia here. We're making a shia here in the meantime, in the middle, for which I asked Rishus for, a bracket. The Rav is going to go through, for everybody's edification. We came up with those as many as 10, but we can play with that number. Steps and making matzahs. Let's start with Alicia.
Yeah. So to clarify, when we're discussing this question of shia, of time that there's a break in the baking of the matzahs, so we start. Most matzah bakeries have what we say 3 rooms. They have the back room where they have the water, the mayim shalanu. They take that water, they pour it into, the water is poured into flour, just plain flour and water. Now, somebody takes that flour and water, this, even, people that want to bake their own matzahs, this job, they know, they leave to the person involved. He sits there and he does lisha. What we usually do the whole year, we use like a mixer. That person sits there and he fetches and he works, he pushes hard, and he makes and he grinds and he mixes the flour and the water. Now, after the flour and the water is mixed, you still have, it's mushy, it's nothing. It doesn't even look close to being a formable dough. Then it's given to someone, he's called in Yiddish a finer. He takes it and he knocks it down hard, and he uses some people use wood, the more machmir now use metal, and he takes that flour and he works hard on that flour, and he knocks it down and hits it again, and he does a complete asik on that. Now, after he has that flour, then he divides into small pieces. Everyone gets now they use a computerized, they have a way to measure to get the exact sizes. Everyone gets a small piece. Now that piece is thrown out to all the different workers, and then there's something called a vegler. He's the person that he's using a roller. He's rolling that fine that flour that was a little more cakey into a flatter piece of matzah. And
what are the Yiddish names for this? You remember?
This is called the vegler.
Vegler with a V.
Yeah, he's a roller.
So the lush guy is called a lush. The second guy, the cutter, what's he called?
Finer.
Finer.
The cutter is just a cutter. He doesn't have a.
Who's the finer?
He's after the lisha. Then the real work, what we call the real asik, is what the finer does. The first person is mixing in a huge bowl, just the flour and water. Then there's someone taking that flour and water, and he's working hard on it. And he's called the finer.
The guy who makes it into the round cake. What's that called?
A finer.
Finer. Okay.
He's actually, he's making it a round cake. Now that round cake is divided into pieces, and that goes to
cut.
It's
cut, no?
It's cut. Yes, it's cut.
So how many pieces did I cut into? Like 12 pieces, no?
It depends on, it depends on how big the size of the isa.
Okay, whatever it is. Yeah, and then they throw it onto the table, right? That's the way
Yes, they throw it onto the table. And
the finer throws it onto the table. The finer throws it onto the table, right?
Right. Well, no, the cutter. The finer gives to the cutter, and then the cutter
gives to the cutter, and the cutter throws it onto the table. Everybody with us so far? Yeah. So far, is there any non-isuk so far? No.
No. The only question the question will be is if the finer has to wait for the cutter, or if the cutter has to wait for the people that he's throwing it to. The main issue gets involved is that if you don't have enough hands on deck, so the cutter throws to the people that are going to be the veglers, they're going to roll it. But if he has a backlog of the piece before that he's working on, then he's going to have a piece there that he's waiting to roll that's already worked on. So that would be the one issue. Then there's the roller, and the roller, since that's hard work to take it from this cake-like mixture to make it into a flat matzah, and then he passes it on. This also could
But
have
the
an issue with
amateurs
Shias.
start at the roller stage, right? That's where the amateurs, the Bechabur are coming, right?
Yes.
So how do they know what to do? Who said they know how to roll?
That's it. That's.
I mean, I have never learned how to roll. I tried it 20 times. I never was able to get a flat, straight matzah out of it. So every Gemara liquid knows how to roll something.
No, so at least what you're gaining is that there is some asic, that there's something that you're not going to make a perfect shape. What you're saving is that the matzah is not left alone. What you're doing is you're pushing and you're giving some asic you're giving asic to the matzah. So the matzah is not left by itself. That's what you're doing by rolling.
Is there someone? I'm trying to remember. Is there someone who takes it after? Let's say you don't produce a perfect matzah shaped thing. What happens to that isa on the floor?
No, I'm saying then they'll just usually when you do a chabur, you'll have other people that work there, and they'll finish it up for you, and they'll make it that
So somebody could take it over from an amateur roller and turn it into a real matzah.
Yeah, or the other thing that you could do in some chabur in Lakewood, Marshall, the people that are running the matzah bakery are so accustomed to chaburas. What they'll do is you're just gonna watch to make sure there's no shias, and you tell them to throw it out. They'll listen to you. If you pay the flour and water, and you pay a price for them to work. If you say that you feel that they waited too long and they try to make too much, they'll say, okay, throw it out.
So are you being Mekayim mitzvah b'shlucha by standing on top of them?
I would think not. If you're not actually doing, you might get the sweat of the Arizal and get kaparas avoidness. But if you're just watching on top,
why? That's the most. Yeah, according to the Rush, that's the most important job, to watch from shias. So why shouldn't I have a mitzvah of?
It could be if mitzvah yosim shulchan is to give cover to the mitzvah. So then you're the one that's making sure it's kosher. So then maybe you would have a key mitzvah yosim shulchan. I hear what you're being worried.
Okay, then, so we're holding at the guy, the rollers, and the amateur and professional rollers. Then what?
Then they pass it on to the next person. That is what we call the redler, that he makes the holes, because we want to make sure the matzah to be as thin as possible and not to have any that shouldn't blow up. So we have making holes.
What's the point of the holes? Explain to them what the point of the holes is.
The air comes
into it. The air comes into the holes, or what? What do the holes do?
The purpose of the ear, that there shouldn't be any nefuchas. There shouldn't blow. There shouldn't be room. If it's too airtight, that there's no space, then some dough, the heat will go in between. Like this, if you have a thicker dough, sometimes you have a chal. It's not fully baked inside. Here, you're getting the heat through and through. You have nothing to worry about.
But what does the hole help? What escapes through the hole? Air from inside the matzah escapes through the hole? Is that
no? I thought that there's no room to have any part that's not going to be cooked. They'll be all evenly baked.
So in other words, the point is to bring the fire into the matzah.
Yes.
Okay.
Then the next step is from after they put in the hole, then they put it on a stick. They bring it to the next room, and there in that second room the matzah is baked. Third room, because the first room is where you do the lisha. You do the lisha, and then you go from there. In the third room, you make that's where it's baked. Now there you have to be careful again that in between the time that they're putting the holes in until they have enough, usually they try to put 3-4 on a stick to bring it to the next room, that there's no time in between. That's another place where you could have occur the shias of the Rosh. Now, if the Seder baking matzahs is clear, I'd like to go back to the words of the Beis Yosef. So the Beis Yosef brings down the Rosh. The Rosh says you can't have any break once you start working. Once you start working on the matzah, you're putting in this heat, and then that heat will aid the chametz process, and there's no longer shear of 18 minutes. Right afterwards, the Beis Yosef quotes the discussion of the Trumas Hadeshin. The Trumas Hadeshin says that there's a discussion about if you waited, you worked on the matzah for 5 minutes, you took a break, you got a phone call in between, then you work for another 10 minutes, then you have another break. Do you combine the two shias in between to say you have one large break of 18 minutes and the matzah will turn into chametz? That is the question that the Beis Yosef quotes from the Shumas Hadeshen. Some are machmer, some are meik. So the Beis Yosef says that it depends what type of asik you did. If it was a full asik, then we say the shias in between are not mafsik. But if it was just you playing around with the dough and you're not a pro and you're just an amateur working on the dough, then if there's a hefsik, then the halacha is you be mitzvah after shias and it comes chametz. This is the words of the Shumas Hadesh. Now, the Darkei Moshe asks, a little lower down, if you get to Darkei Moshe, these two halachas are an oxymoron, they're a straight stira. If the halacha is like the Rosh, that you can't have any shias whatsoever, and any break is the issue, what's the discussion of being starved two shias? If the halacha is that you have 18 minutes after you finished working on the dough, and a break is a problem, so then we understand that the machlokes if you can starve two different shias. But if the halacha is that you have to have no break whatsoever, what's the shaila being starved to two shias? So we can see the Darkei Moshe Ois Gimel. It's right there, just as the screen's a little covered. Sorachin, says the Darkei Moshe, the mashma da Rosha ben Yeruchim Leslie High Svara Sharei Kosvu. They said once you had heat of working on it from your hands, there's no sheer mill whatsoever. He quotes the Shumas Hadeshen. It's not like a Rebbeinu Yeruchim. He says, who holds like this shita? That's the tshuva. He quotes the Shuvas HaRaj. At the Ramban had an interesting minute. The Ramban worked on the matzahs in one house, and then he sent the matzahs to a different tanner. So the Ramban worked on the matzahs in one house. He sent the matzahs to a second home, and he had no problem with that. The Ramban switched his minute. Maybe the tanner, the second tanner, will be full. So the Ramban had a minute that he worked on the matzahs in one house. He sent it to be baked in the second house. Then the Ramban said, I'm nervous because I'm working on my house, and then bring it to the second house where they had the fire. Maybe there'll be a backlog on the fire, and then the matzahs will weigh more than a mil. So it says the Darkei Moshe, I see clearly that the Ramban was not worried for the Chumrah of the Rosh. The Ramban was not concerned for Chalal for the Chumrah of the Rosh. Because if the Ramban would be concerned for the Chumrah of the Rosh, then there'll be no issue there'll be no heter to send to another house. So you see clearly that this shear, we know for sure that the Rosh would not allow. When I first came on, we were discussing what's the shear of the Rosh that's called the shear. That you're waiting, no assembly line can be perfect. You're going to have to wait a few seconds here, a few seconds there. Can't be perfect. But we know clearly Shumas Hadeshen, the Darkei Moshe is saying to bring from house A to house B would be according to the Rosh, would be an Isser of Shia. But the Darkei Moshe's main issue at hand is how could the Beis Yosef quote both? How could the Beis Yosef quote the Rosh that says that you can't have any Shias whatsoever? It was called Rosh Matzos, and second later discuss the Shumas Hadeshen if you mitzvah after two Shias. These two things are a direct contradiction one to another. So if we could go to the Shulchan Aruch, the same steer you have in Shulchan Aruch. We're not sure what to do, what the Pesach is. Are we choishev for the Rosh, or are we not choishev for the Rosh? So in the Shulchan Aruch, at Siman Tofn and Tes, he quotes that the Tofn and Tes Beis. He quotes the words of he quotes the shita, he quotes the Shumas Hadesh about she is being mitzarfen. Base. That Shulchan Aruch just is.
What are you looking for? The Mishabura?
Oh no! Oh, says the Mechaber. Lo yanichenu ha'isa b'leis v'afilu rega echad. So that lechatchilo for sure everybody agrees you should be oisik on the matzah. V'chol zman she'oiskim boi afilu kol hayoyim ein machmas. Even if you're working it the whole day, it does not become chametz. Then if you leave it b'leisik shir mil, then it becomes chametz. And then he says what the shir mil is. Then the Ramah, who's the Darkei Moshe, says yesh lahachmir l'mar binyan asiyas hamatzos. You should go as quickly as possible. Ki yesh lochash shashiyas yitzarfu. So here he quotes the words of Shuvas Hadesh and that shiyas are mitzarf. And then in the next page, a second later, Chaber tells us if you may niach b'lo yesik. The next page in the Mishnah Berurah. He says, "V'achashen is asik b'posik." He quotes the Rosh. Yanichenu b'lo yesik miyad yachmetz. He says the Rosh that if you leave it without asik, comes chametz right away. So what's going on here? The Darkei Moshe says that it's a stira to quote the Shumas Hadesh. The Darkei Moshe himself, the Ramah quotes the Shumas Hadesh, and Yishi Machmer, the Shias won't become its back. So it says the Mishnah Berurah Yud Ches, miyad yachmetz. The fees that sort we could point to Yudches. The fees that sort we zor ma'oid. La'achar she'orchu v'riddu hamatzah menichem oisim l'fnei hamenaker. So Mishnah Berurah says after you hit the matzah, you put it in front of the menaker, yanikenu oisim miyad. And then after the menaker, you should bring it to the Tana miyad. Why? Kivan shela'achar she'nis asik boy machmetzes miyad. Comes chametz miyad. Miyad she's misalt masidai mimenu. Va'oilom ein nizorim b'zeh kol kach. So Mishnah Berurah says the minig is not machmer. The minig is not machmer for this Rosh. He doesn't know why. So he says ve'efsher the miyad the kol mechamer lav daf. So when mechaber says miyad, it's lav daf. El rotza loimer shir muat. It's a shir. It's a certain amount of time. Mikol mokoim lechatchila bevada yesh lezor milanechenu kach afilu rega echad emefsh ukana beroish hasif. So lechatchila he says you shouldn't leave it for 1 second. But the Eved he doesn't give us a shir.
What the shir? Saying 1 second means 1 second? Is that what you're saying? If I take my even if you're pounding something, you have to move your hand up and down. I mean, right?
I would think it would be stopping, while you're still oisik, 1 second is not. I would assume 1 second is lav dafka. It have to be,
Can you describe for us a shia that would cause a good chaber to throw the matzah out in this process? You talked already about the problem of scheduling between the thrower and the cutter and all that. That in a professional bakery doesn't happen, right? It doesn't happen, right?
There was.
That in the first stage that you described, the first 3 stages that we divided up.
Yeah, that's not an issue.
That doesn't usually happen, right?
The issue starts when they're sending it off to
on the table. The table.
So,
right. Have you seen a shia happen and a matzah get thrown out? So
the way that in that depends. Every chabura depends on how stringent you are. Is it? Would you say? Some people would say even 10 seconds. Others would say a little longer. That's it all depends on the how machmer you are. Rav Shmuel Kamenetsky and others in Rav Shmuel Kamenetsky in Sefer Hilchos Pesach says less than a minute he wouldn't be choshev for b'chlal. After a minute, he would think that's already when you're getting into where the Mishnah Berurah would be machmer. Because like you quoted the Bir Halacha later on, he says it can't be, can't be exactly, it's not possible to have without a break for a little bit. But after a minute is when people would start to be worried and they would throw out the matzah.
And that means that the guy walked away from the table? The guy, what did he do to cause this 2-minute delay? What did he do? I mean, what's the Metzias?
Metzias is that he he had matzahs. He had a backlog that he had.
Who's he?
That if you don't,
Who's
you don't
he?
have. Well, let's say by the redler, the person that's making the holes. If he had two matzahs waiting, and he only has two hands, so he did the first matzah, and then he has to do the second matzah. So the first matzah, the second matzah, they would throw out.
Or the guy with the sticks, or the shiver. Where I mean, you're telling me that the Matzias is that the shias don't happen on the table with the amateurs. You're telling me the shias happen with the professionals in the third room? Is that what you're saying?
No, the third room is the oven. That's for sure a problem. The issue would be if, let's say, after they divide the pieces, they throw it to the guy to work, and then if he has two pieces waiting to be done, then the second piece they would throw out.
The second piece of throw, he won't even throw it on the table. You mean?
Yeah.
If there's delay in the table, the backlog in the table, he'll get rid of the second piece.
Yes.
How do they get rid of it? That it shouldn't be machmet agav. What do they do with it?
They're baking a week before 2 weeks before Pesach. They just throw it out.
They have to take it outside of the bakery. What do they throw into a garbage can? They throw into a garbage can on the side.
Yeah.
Huh?
Now another issue that you could have is that most chabur samak put on is that even in a batch of matzah, you do a batch of flour and water. You're doing multiple runs. So in between every run, they're cleaning the table. That's what a lot of times what they need your hands on deck for chabura is that you're doing. They did the first run of, let's say, 12 pieces. Then they're working on it again. The finer's working on more flour, and he's passing it along. But the original dough that was on the table was already worked on. So if you don't clean up that matzah in a regular non-chabura production, they're working on hard paper. They throw it out every 18 minutes. If you're in a chabura production, then what they'll throw, they would clean it up in between every run of matzah because you worked on your first batch. Let's say you made 100 pounds. You did the first 20 pounds. What went through its run. Now in that 18 minutes, you're doing another run. And a third run, and a fourth run. So the table has in it little small pieces of dough that were worked on already. According to the Rosh, that would be a problem with Shias. And if you don't clean that, then you'll have an issue where we could have a Shia of 10 minutes. That's going to pass miyad. That would not be Chabur Matz. Any regular run that's not going to clean up in between run 1 and run 2, you run into an issue that you're not going to be Chabur. You're not going to get the chumrah of the Rosh.
Why does it have to in between runs? Why can't the little pieces get machmets on the table b'shas ma'isa?
They will. So any dough that you're going to put on top of that is going to have that little small piece inside, and then you're going to have an issue of.
So then you're back to the 18 minutes. You're back there. You lost your rush right away. Any tiny piece that's there for more than a second, you lost your rush. No.
You're right, but usually that is part of the first piece that you're working on, and whatever falls out. Your piece that you're throwing into the oven doesn't have that, and
so the matzah
whatever
is good.
made it
But you're worried about
on.
But the matzah is good. The pieces,
your matzah is good, but your pieces left on the table are not an issue.
Right.
Are not going to be rosh matzahs because the second run. So if you only get the first run, then you're good. But if you have a second run, then the pieces left on the table from every 18 minutes are not going to be rosh matzahs.
And no one changes the paper in between each run.
The chaburas do that. They would clean up in between to change it. But a regular matzah,
between each run, they change the paper, or between each run.
Yeah, on even the 18 minutes, they're changing. They're cleaning. They're cleaning the sticks that they're working. That every batch of every run should be fresh
Clean.
And have nothing left from the original dough. Now this is the chumrah of the Rosh. Now, the Bir Halacha goes at great length to clarify the Rosh. Because the Gemara tells us very clearly that matzah takes 18 minutes to come chametz. According to the Rosh, it's not true. Comes chametz once you start working right away. So the Mishnah Berurah says that even according to the Rosh, it has to be somewhat into the process that you're working. If you just put flour and water together and you just have a dough, what he calls the Isa Megugelis, he says based off a Gemara, the Gemara says that there was a Talmud that was in front of his Rebbe, and he had an Isa that came, and he realized that it's going to come chametz, he came after it, before 18 minutes. So he says clearly, an Isa, just making a dough of flour and water, even though you mixed it already, that does not come chametz right away. That's step one of the Chiddush of the Bir Halacha. Then the Bir Halacha says, but he knows there are many Rishonim that disagree on the Rosh. And he quotes a Rambam. I'm sorry, I did not put up the Rambam, but I could read the Rambam inside. He says, the Rambam clearly disagrees on this Chumrah of the Rosh. The Rambam says in Perek Hey Halacha Yud Gimel, Kol Zman she'odam oisik bebatzek, afilu kol hayoyim.
Hold on, 1 second, please, quite a Rav. 1 second. We do have the Rambam. We will put the Rambam up if you don't give us.
It's very important. The Rambam is the exact opposite.
The Rambam. Rabbi, it's in Rabbi Katz's package. There you go.
The Rambam says clearly you could have an Isa for many hours, doesn't turn into chametz. Perek Hey Halacha Yud Gimel. Kol zman she'odam oisik bebatzek, afilu kol hayom kula eni baladei chimetz. You're working on the dough the whole day, it doesn't come with chimetz. V'mikbiya yodoi v'nichoi v'shoa botzek ad shtagia lashmiya kol. Then he says, if you pick up your hand after you worked on it the whole day, then the sheer mill kicks in. So Mishnah Berurah says, you see clearly from the Rambam that the Rambam disagreed on the Chumrah of the Rosh, and the Rambam holds that there's no halacha of any shias. You could have shias, but once you're oisik in it, then you have 18 minutes. So the Rambam and the Rosh have a fundamental disagreement. What makes matzah into chametz? According to the Rosh, you have 18 minutes when you put the flour into water. You have to have a finished product. But if you work on it, you can work on it more than 18 minutes. But once you, from flour into water, the original dough, you have 18 minutes. The Rambam says clearly, no, you can work on it the whole day. And then afterwards, you could put it into, you have 18 minutes. Now, I did see that but we have a steer in the Shulchan Aruch how the Shulchan Aruch goes. There are those that want to be miyashev, that maybe Mishnah Berurah didn't go with this, but to say that maybe the Chumrah of the Rosh only applies after you have, let's say, you worked on the dough for 18 minutes. If you put asik into the dough, then we say any shia afterwards comes chametz. Now, what we're machmer for, even if you don't work on it for 18 minutes. You worked on it for 45 seconds, a minute. We say once you take a break, it comes chametz. Maybe the Rosh is only going in the case that a person put a full shear of 18 minutes of asik into the matzah. Then we say the miyadu machmetz. But if a person didn't put the 18 minutes asik into it, then you'd have more time, and the shias miyad wouldn't come chametz. But the Chazon Ish did not buy this chumrah whatsoever in the Mishnah Berurah. This is one of the coolest of the Chazon Ish. You know, Chazon Ish was known more for his chumras, but here is a tremendous cool of the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish says the Rosh does not mean to say that miyadu machmetz, that's guaranteed it comes chametz. The Rosh is saying that miyad, it starts to become chametz, and you have to be careful. But if you don't see any signs of chametz, there's didn't rise at all. It's still the same dough as before. There's no issue whatsoever, and you don't have to worry. The Chazon Ish was not too concerned for this chumrah of the Mishnah Berurah. There's actually a story told that after the Chazon Ish passed away, Chaim Kanievsky, the Tzal, brought matzah to Reuven Katz, who was the Rav in Petach Tikva. And he asked him, how was the matzah baking this year without the Chazon Ish? He said that when we had the Chazon Ish law, if we had any shaila, any sofik, he came along to bake. And he told us, is this a shia or not? Now that we don't have the Chazon Ish to be machriya, we had to be machriya on every shaila. We threw out a lot more matzah than usual. What can we say that now we don't have Reb Chaim to ask shailas to? For sure, any shaila she would have to be more machriya. But the Chazon Ish did not go for this chumrah of the Mishnah Berurah, and he felt he was able to tell if there's any sign of chametz coming in, and he said you don't have to wait, you don't have to worry. Even if you waited a little bit, there'd be no issue of shias. And he also felt that the little pirurim left on the table He held that it's not an issue. You don't have to be machmer to clean it in between each batch. Because for this same taina, he held that the Rosh doesn't mean to say it's guaranteed it becomes chametz. He says the chametz process starts, but there's no Allah. It's not like the Mishnah Berurah assumed that miyadu machmetz, that straight up it's guaranteed that it's chametz. So to make a sikum, we would have the chumrah of the Rosh that any shias is an issue. Any time that after you started working on the dough, which the Mishnah Berurah clarifies, is not when you start mixing the flour and the water. It's after you have the flour and water all mixed. You have a gooey mish that's given to a person who's called the finer. He makes it into more to a cake-like shape. Then the issue of Shia start, and then any Shia afterwards will be an issue. And the Mishnah Berurah says, miyad, which he says in Bir Alocha, Tov Samachalav can't be obviously a second, but that's when the Isser of Shias would start. And then we go from there that any time there'll be a break afterwards, there'll be an issue. That's the Shita of the Mishnah Berurah. He points out that the Rambam clearly disagrees on this halacha, and the Rambam holds you have 18 minutes even after you put in a full asik. And then we have the Shita of the Chazon Ish that you don't have to, the Rosh is not a concrete halacha that after it started to, after you have a Shia, it's guaranteed that it's chametz. It's not chametz gomer. He's saying it starts the chametz process, and you'd have to go quicker, but it's not guaranteed that it's chametz. There was another mahalach that I saw, Timyasha the Minig Olam, that, as we know, the Sfardim have much thicker matzos. So there, maybe we have to be more worried about the dough waiting. Our matzos that are a little thinner, and they bake much faster, and we have them out in 10 minutes to have out the matzos. Maybe there, that's why the olam became less zoyer for this chumrah the Rosh. Another way
I asked two ironies. There's a several questions on the show, and I point out two ironies. First of all, Chazon Ish was, are you telling me the Chazon Ishniks are not machmer and shias in Bnei Brak? Is that what you're telling me? They couldn't, obviously, at this point, you can't ask Chaim Zatzal, couldn't ask Chaim on every single matzah. And he didn't go to every bakery in Bnei Brak. So you're telling me they don't now machmer and shias because Chazon Ish is not machmer and shias? Is that what you're telling me, Lamaisa?
I can't tell you what they do Allah Lamaisa. The Chazon Ish is clearly what wasn't machmer. The Chazon Ish himself, when he I would say like this. In brisk, if it's out for 3 seconds, they're throwing it out.
Well, that's my next question. The Rambam says it's not a problem, so they have machmer against the Rambam, basically.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Chiddush, right?
Yes. Well, it's the Rosh and it's Shulchan Aruch brings it. So.
No, I understand why, but I'm saying it's an irony. That's all. They're being machmer keneged a Rambam's kula, right? That's what they're whatever. If it's out more than 3 seconds, it's in the garbage. That's the bottom line. It's
in the garbage. Now, the Chazon Ish, I assume that you want to know if now that are they more because, the world became more, everyone follows the Mishnah Berurah, did things change? I can't tell you, but what happens in Bnei Brak, but al pi halacha, they wouldn't be as, machmer, to be concerned about, for the Shias of the Rosh.
I hear. Okay, there's an interesting aura here that the hidur, the mitzvah by Mishnah Shluchai, is a hidur only in a hechsher mitzvah because the mitzvah is not the baking, the mitzvah is the eating. So there's a mitzvah by Shluchai in a hidur mitzvah, in a hidur of a hechsher mitzvah. That's the question.
Yes, that's a very good question. The Welt says the Achronim, the Reshiva say that it'll be totally. The Gemara says mitzvah by Yosef and Shluchai and Kedusha. Is the mitzvah to get married, or Kedushin is really a hechsher mitzvah pruruvu? So if you hold that there's no mitzvah to get married, it's like the Rosh holds it's not a birchas mitzvahs. Nesuin is a birchas shvach. So then you see clearly, even on a hechsher mitzvah, you say mitzvah b'yosem v'shluchai. The other proof, we'll get to that if it's a clear raya, is hachana for Shabbos. Is the preparation for Shabbos a hechsher mitzvah or the mitzvah itself? Simply, one could have said preparing food for Shabbos is also a hechsher mitzvah. You go into the store, you buy pomegranate, you go into any store, Glak Gourmet, you buy stuff for full Shabbos, you also have, you could be Mekayim Oinik Shabbos. That the Briskerov disagreed on. He said that the mitzvah of Kavod Shabbos is that you yourself should prepare. So there he said, maybe there it's not a hechsher mitzvah in itself.
Why can't the Briskerov hold that Oinik Shabbos, Kavod Shabbos before Shabbos, Lukas there is before Shabbos? So right. Why is there not mitzvah by Yisrael on all the Kavod Shabbos before Shabbos?
I think there is.
So you would say there is. That's Moshe Buta. That's Kufa
Yes.
Moshe Buta.
Yes,
So
that's Gemara. Now the question
so why
of
do
the
we
Gemara
allow?
is
Why did it become Neris Nashim Mitzvah? That's already a
that's the oldest. Yeah. But according to Rav Moshe Buta, so the question is that a hechsher mitzvah, the mitzvah itself? The mitzvah said no. Covered Shabbos is to prepare for Shabbos. The covered that itself is a mitzvah by itself. But maybe other mitzvahs there would be no mitzvah. It's only a hechsher mitzvah. It'll be telling this Shabbos, yeah, mitzvah by Yisim Shluchim.
So what would you say L'gabei Chilus Matzah?
So I would say L'gabei Chilus Matzah. If the Magen Avram says you have mitzvah by Yisim Shluchim, you see clearly he's of the opinion even on a hechsher mitzvah you have mitzvah by Yisim Shluchim. That's why I thought the Rosh didn't say mitzvah by Yisim Shluchim. He said the reason of who masik lechem oini that you're baking because you can't say mitzvah by Yisim Shluchim. There's no mitzvah in baking matzahs. It's only hechsher mitzvah.
Right. Okay. One other question that came up in the Chanashir. So the Mishpur said brings the Rishonim. You can't have a tanner. You can't have any heat in the house in the room.
Yes.
The bakery is the middle of December. There's no heat in the matzah bakery. They shouldn't freeze in the cold, or it's just for fire. You just can't have another open fire in the room. What's the prat?
I would think it's
mashma. You can't have chayim in the room.
It's interesting. It's a very good question. Most matzah bakers are mahader that the temperature is set at 68 degrees for this issue. They assume that 68 degrees
is low enough because it won't be macham 68 degrees.
Yeah,
that's air conditioning, HVAC is macham matzah.
No.
Are they talking about the time of Chazal when you had a fire in the room? That's what they meant, right? They're telling you not to have a fire, not to have any outside external heat. A natural gas heater or an oil burner, and a thing that's considered chimum in a room.
Pashtas not because it doesn't make it so hot. The chum is discussing the heat of a fire. The oven is very hot.
Right.
That's a heat of 1500 degrees. There you have to be machmar. The little heat that you're going to get from a baseboard heater or a space heater or even something more than that, I would assume should not be an issue. Right. But the lemaisa, the minig of matzah bakers is not to put on the heat to 75. So if a person needs it warm, he should not be working in a matzah baker.
I got it. Okay. I see that more or less that answers the question. We thank you very, very much. Yesher Koyach. Thank you for your time and for the mamish, the clear, lucid presentation, including all the Yiddish. And now we know the names of all the. We're still missing one or two, right? We're missing the
divider,
the cutter, We're missing. Yeah, the Schneider. Okay, Yesher Koyach. Rabbi said tonight is Tuesday, so we have a break tonight. We'll reconvene tomorrow.
I see. She is mitzvah.
That's the machlekes. Trum Sedesh.
The other and the Maril. That's she. Yes.
How do we pass? Can we pass it l'kula l'chayra? No, I mean.
It depends. We go with the chiluk of the Beis Yosef. It depends if it was a real. It depends what type of Isaac you did in between. If you did if between Shia Aleph and Shia Beis, in between you were Isaac, a real Isaac, you knew what you were doing. You weren't just hitting the matzah to keep yourself busy. Then the Shia is a nametz. But if it's if it was just a fake ASIC, then the Shias would be mitzvah. But it's not such an issue because over our matzahs are 18 minutes. So that's the Darkei Moshe stira. No one's making matzahs that are not done in 18 minutes.
Okay, very good. So we have to see we didn't see the Chazon Ish side. We didn't get a chance, and we'll come back to Rav the Rav with Mazakas with. We'll see everybody tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock to prepare for everything else this year. Yesher Koyach, and you want to say a word about Reb Chaim before you go? Do you have anything to add? Well, okay, Rabbi Said, we learned this week, of course, L'zech Nishmas, Rabbeinu Shmara Yosef Chaim Ben Reb Yaakov Yisrael. We'll see you all tomorrow at 11 o'clock.